Okay, welcome to Australian China Institute for Arts and Culture. My name is Tony Xiaoren. I'm a research fellow here, and I'm going to chair today's seminar. So I'll start by acknowledging the traditional custodian of the land where we stand here today, and the Darug people of the Darug Nation, and pay our respects to the elders, past and present. So today we are very pleased to have Professor Michael Williams with us. He is recently appointed as adjunct professor of the institute. So so it's great that we have him in the team and his expertise in the Chinese Australian studies. This is one of the key areas of research in this institute. And we have, through Michael, organized a series of seminars on this topic. Last year we had a wonderful seminar by Michael, the opening seminar of this series, which is an overview of the field of Australian Chinese studies. And this year we are going to have 6 seminars in a chronicle order and covering different periods of time in the Chinese Australian history. And today it is the first seminar of this series of lectures. And Michael is going to talk about the very early years of the Chinese-Australian interactions. And he will talk about the issues like trade, discovery, labor, and many other interesting things. And we will have the rest of the seminar roughly at a monthly basis. So if you are interested, please pay attention to our website and advertisement. So we'll pay attention to the dates. One last thing before I hand over to Michael. You find some little gift from the Institute on your seat. So this is the exhibition there in the gallery. And the artist will have a workshop in the following week. So if you like her work, you can come to listen to more from her works. So now, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Michael.
Okay, thank you, Tony, and welcome everybody. And hope you'll enjoy the series. It won't be dull as Alice in Wonderland. Alice once thought history was. So, as Tony mentioned, this is the beginning of a series, and I just want to mention, apart from telling you what the basic rundown of the series is to, it's got of course a lot of dates there, but just to remember that dates are very arbitrary and shouldn't be taken very seriously. But I just want to point out one aspect of these dates is that some of them you recognise from Australian history, 1788 of course, arrival of the First Fleet, 1851, beginning of the gold rushes. But then I've also got dates such as 1911, which is more important in Chinese history than it is in Australian history. And so just to show how events in China are reflecting back on Australian history as well. 1972, a date that combines Australia-China relations, for example. So it's a matter of interchange. The Australian history is all about the links with China as much as anything else. So the other thing I want to tell you is why a reflective history. So what I mean by that is that the present and the past are always interacting and reflecting back. So in this series, I won't, even though I'm going back to before 1788 or back to early 19th century, I'll also be talking about events in the present and how they influence our perceptions of the past. And that's because I believe in this other quote, which again, I maybe get people to guess where they think that one's from. The truth may be out there, but the lies are inside your head. And by that, of course, I mean that stereotypes and assumptions are very important in how we perceive history or how we try to argue about history. Misinterpretations are common and sometimes outright lies. And history is very often used and abused to meet the needs of the present. And certainly this is happening today, but of course has always happened. And one perspective that I want you to remember that'll appear quite a few times throughout this lecture series is that China's weakness has influenced perceptions of the past, just as China's strength now is influencing perceptions today. So this idea, again, doesn't really matter whether China is weak or strong, or what it does with its strength, it's the perception that's most important. I've entitled this first lecture, Before There Was Gold, The reason I do that is one of the most persistent stereotypes of the Chinese in Australia is that they're all gold miners. And that's the beginning and the end of the history as far as many people are concerned. And of course, like all good stereotypes, there's an element of truth in that. Of course, many were gold miners, and gold mining and the gold rushes are a very important aspect of the overall history, just as gold rushes were important overall in Australia's history. But there's a lot more to the story. And so the focus in this first lecture will be entirely on the period before the gold rushes. The focus here is the period before gold was discovered in Australia and even before Europeans began to settle in Australia. So this first period I'll talk about the pre-1788 up till around about 1818, and I'll be talking about three themes: discovery, trade and labour. I'll be asking a few questions. So one of those questions is, who discovered Australia? But more significantly, why is this important? Who is it important to? Also, I'll ask the question, who was the first Chinese person in Australia? And why is that an important question? And finally, another question that's always important, as important today as it was in the past, is it better to have cheap goods or higher wages? And this is a theme that runs right through Australian history and particularly involves Chinese people in Australia. So we mentioned Zheng He and sea cucumbers, we're mentioning seal furs and tea, the line of Parramatta, a modern artist, Zhou Xiaoping and his art, and again the long arm of the present with an example from former president of China, Hu Jintao. So, before there was gold, can this be very much? So as I said, we'll be talking about discovery, trade and labour. These last two elements of this history have continued to have an impact to the present day, but the first, discovery, is perhaps even more significant insofar as it impacts upon identity and the ability to, as it were, lay a claim to Australia and a role in Australian history. So, who discovered Australia and why does it matter? Well, this question is of course all about staking a claim. So you can see from this map, this is a map that existed before Captain Cook began his own voyages of exploration, and you can see from that quite a large parts of Australia were well known to the Europeans before Captain Cook ever arrived on the scene. But also we're going to look at the influence of tripang and Chinese cuisine, Zheng He versus James Cook, and Shou and Zhou Xiaoping. So going back, in 2003, the then President of China visited Australia and he made a speech before Parliament. And in that speech, probably much to John Howard's shock and horror, he declared that China had long since known about Australia, long before the Europeans. The Chinese had settled in Australia and had traded with Aboriginal people. Now this shocked quite a few historians as well, and by and large we thought the President was staking a claim in Australia. Now we don't know who was informing the President of China about this kinds of history, but by and large there's no evidence for that. But these kinds of claims, these kinds of the Chinese must have discovered Australia at some point, come up again and again. Another example is this figurine, the Shou, which was discovered in Darwin in the 19th century, late 19th century, or near Darwin in the late 19th century. And some people have speculated that this must be a Ming Dynasty figurine, and if it was, it must have been dropped there by Zheng He, or if not by Zheng He, one of his captains who sailed by and naturally discovered Australia, but then failed to mention it in their records. So again, this has been by and large identified as simply a soapstone figurine from the 19th century and was probably dropped there simply by one of the many Chinese people that were living in Darwin, in and around Darwin at the time. Now that doesn't mean there was no connection. In fact, there was definitely a Chinese connection with Australia that predates European settlement and invasion. So we have this record from a Dutch trader who was living in Timor at the time. He reported back to his Dutch East India Company, a Chinese trader returning from a trip to the south of 5 days sailing before the wind and 2 days and nights having drifted, reported to have visited a land of people who were very black and the hair very woolly. So obviously Timor is very close to Australia, and the Dutch trader simply announced, oh, he must have been visiting the Southland, which the Dutch trader also knew all about. So it's very probable that this is certainly evidence of the first actual Chinese person to have gone all the way down to Australia. Now the reason he was doing that is not tree palm, not sea cucumber. He was actually looking for tortoiseshell, this particular trader. So presumably these Chinese traders were wandering around looking for all kinds of things. But we do know about this connection back to China. It's well documented. It existed from at least the 18th century. Not necessarily done by Chinese traders directly, but by Magassins and others from what's now central Indonesian islands, travelling down to northern Australia, using Aboriginal people to help them to harvest the sea cucumber and then taking them back and trading them back up through Manila to China. So this is a link that of course is well known among Aboriginal people in the north. It's often declared a forgotten history. Every now and again you'll see an ABC article or something which will declare this to be a forgotten history, and they've rediscovered it. It's not so much a forgotten history as a history that for various reasons doesn't penetrate into mainstream consciousness. But it does, of course. It's very conscious as far as Aboriginal people are concerned, and it's something that's been well known for a long, long time. It went on, in fact, till 1906 before the trade was stopped by administrators in the Northern Territory. In fact, the Australian government had taxed this trade for many years, charging £50 in Singapore gold sovereigns right through the 19th century. When Matthew Flinders was circumnavigating Australia, he counted 80 ships coming down in the fleet to collect the sea cucumber. This had dropped gradually over the 19th century until finally a ban stopped it completely. And academics have known about this trade right through the 60s and 70s. Academics have constantly researched it, but again, it has to be rediscovered again and again. So you've got this idea of why people don't quite grasp this as just a normal part of Australian history. Another perspective that brings us back to a Chinese connection is the work of Chinese-Australian artist Joe Xiaoping, who's been working with Indigenous artists such as John Bonham to create art based upon this history, and to hopefully use that art to certainly get the story out as far as the Indigenous people of Northern Australia are concerned, but also hopefully allow this story to penetrate more into consciousness throughout the rest of Australia. So what does these disputes about who discovered Australia tell us? What they tell us is that people are always trying to lay a claim. Now, it was common not so long ago that people just simply grandly announced that Captain Cook discovered Australia, and that was the end of the story. Right through the 50s and 60s, that was a common way of describing Australian history. And this, of course, completely denied any Indigenous discoveries or settlement in Australia for tens of thousands of years. And so this was, of course, all about the British and British descended people laying a claim and saying, well, we discovered Australia, therefore we own it, we deserve it, we deserve everything we get out of it. And that gradually changed in the 60s and 70s, and people began to talk about the Dutch and the Portuguese and other European involvements. And you remember from the map previously, quite a large part in mapping most of the coasts of Australia. But that was more about Australians wanting to distance themselves from the British and become more independent, and so by widening the scope a little bit, they were saying we're not so dependent upon the British. So it's quite natural then that Australians of Chinese heritage would begin to make their own connections and claims and want to make some kind of connection, whether it's a fanciful one through Zheng He or a more linked one through the traders looking for sea cucumber in the north. The other thing is to say is that as far as the Macassans and the northern trade is concerned, as I mentioned before, it's still a continuing confusion as far as white mainstream Australia is concerned. They still have this strong narrative that Australia was a completely isolated land. Yes, we recognise that. Indigenous people were here for 60,000 years, but they were completely isolated from the rest of the world until the Europeans arrived and reconnected it. And so they don't really know what to make of this Macassan connection, but Indigenous people know what to make of it, and they often use it as a way of distancing themselves from the European history and to say, well, we had other connections that predate that. This brings us to the First Fleet. This is a well-known connection. We go on to the story of the 11 ships that leave Britain in 1787 and sail down using the trade routes that had been opened up by the Dutch. The trade winds going on in the south, and Dutch characteristically turned north earlier. The First Fleet continued on to what's now Sydney. But what's not less well known is that 3 ships of the First Fleet in May of 1788 set sail for China. Now the reason they did that is because they were actually ships of the East India Company that had been hired by the British to take convicts to Sydney, and then once they'd finished with that task, they then naturally sailed on to southern China, to Canton, where many European factories existed, to continue their trade links and then continue back on to Europe. So this, from the very beginning of the European settlement in Australia, there was this connection with China. And this was not a fleeting connection, it's quite a strong connection. So for example, in 1821, Commissioner Bigg was sent out by the British to investigate the colony, which had been around for about a generation by that stage. And he announced, or he complained rather, that the high level of tea drinking, which he considered a luxury, was due to the existence of an intercourse with China from the foundation of the colony. And of course this is natural. For a colony stuck on the far side of the Australian continent, the nearest ports are either Batavia with the Dutch in the Dutch East Indies, or further up. There's no Hong Kong at this time, of course, but there was the port of Canton, which had many European traders. And this is connected in various ways. The seal there that I pictured is because, again, we often forget that Sydney Harbour and all the coast of Australia was full of seal populations in the early days, and they've all long since been hunted out. But in these early days, they began to hunt them and take the seal fur and traded it with China. So this was a major trade that went on in the early years of Port Jackson. And this Canton punch bowl, this punch bowl has a scene from about 1815 of Sydney Harbour. That bowl was manufactured in Canton, in Guangzhou. And again, this shows the link you've got here. This bowl was, of course, made to be sold in the European market. It's a big punch bowl on display at the Mitchell Library in Sydney. And you can see they've taken what would, to the Europeans or the British, would have been an exotic scene from the far distant colony of Sydney, placed it, used Chinese to manufacture it into a saleable market, a saleable commodity, and then shipped it off to Europe. So again, establishing this link that Sydney or the colony of New South Wales had with China. But of course that soon means a connection with people. Now, in recent times, as recently as 2018, there was a big celebration of the 200 years of the Chinese in Australia. And this was marked by the arrival of Mark Saying in Sydney in 1818. As a well-known person, a person with a name identification, links to Australian history. He ran a pub in Parramatta, among other things, called The Lion, right here, not far away. His family continues to exist in Australia, descendants today, most living down in Melbourne or scattered around, the Sayings. This is his grandson, John Joseph Saying, who is wearing the uniform of the New South Wales militia. So by the time he's grown up, he's obviously well integrated into Australian or colonial society. So this is all true, and this is all very good, and it's all helped people to establish their claims and links, just to identify with this Chinese person and say, well, Chinese have been in Australia for 200 years. It's a bit of a myth in the sense that he wasn't the first person. There were quite a number of other Chinese people. As I say, Sydney was trading with China, so naturally there were many people arrived as seamen, as traders and so forth, and we have their names, various names reported in the newspapers, but we don't know much else about them apart from that name. So Mark Saying makes a better symbol. And again, the point I want to make is that symbols and myths are good, but they have a purpose, and that purpose isn't always historical. Historians knew about Mark Saying for many years. I can remember looking at the papers from the Doyle family, who'd done their family history, and that had uncovered their ancestor, Mark Saying. It's now, the papers are all in the Mitchell Library. But historians knew about it, but most people weren't that interested. They became interested, became a fixture in Australian history when people felt they had some way of identifying. And that, of course, had to wait until much larger numbers of people identifying as Chinese Australians and wanting to identify with this history. So I'll just make some preliminary conclusions at this point, just before I continue on with the next section. So I just want to say, China and the Chinese have always been a part of Australian history, as we can see from these early trading links. But also, history is always a matter of being affected by the long arm of the present. And having a stake in Australia and laying a claim is very important. Identifying with the past to uphold the present is very important. But that means that history then has to deal with history versus myths and stereotypes versus details. So this is a constant with any kind of historical view of the world. And also, this point I want to make, that I've made with a few examples, of the resistance of popular history to academic history, which is to say, this idea of forgotten histories, you can't really forget a history if you've never learnt it. So by and large, the history is there. It's often buried away in academic journals or academic articles, or academics know about it, but they despair trying to get this out into wider popular domains until the ABC or someone else comes up with it, and they usually do a fair to middling job of presenting this, at best, a fair to middling job of presenting this history. And then it can often be forgotten again the next year, and then until yet another journalist comes along. So this kind of thing happens until there's a reason for perhaps holding on to this history. So as an Indigenous voice grows, so the Macassan trade becomes more important. As people identify as Chinese Australians, so Marxism becomes more important in history. So what I'll be doing as part of this series is I'll be suggesting some readings for people. These are just not definitive, of course. These are just examples that they'll go up on the website. There's an Australian Chinese history website section. So now I'm going to talk about the period leading up to the gold rush period, 1851. So basically, the colony in New South Wales has been established as a convict colony. And so here we're talking more about connections with labour and empire and ownership, which ownership could, of course, be put in quotation marks as well. Is it better to have cheap goods or higher wages? That's a question I asked before. And this brings up questions of convicts versus coolies, coolies versus sojourners, and perceptions of empire. So here we'll be talking about Tasmanian Carpenters and Amoy Shepherds, Opium and Empire, Pearl River Delta villages in Hong Kong, and again, the long arm of the present. So I'm going to begin with 9 Chinese carpenters. So in 1830, 9 carpenters are brought to Tasmania under contract as carpenters, as specialist skills workers. And in the announcement of that in the Launceston Advertiser, the labour issue is clearly defined. So these carpenters are, according to the report, likely to reduce the prices of cabinet work. And however displeasing such falls in price may prove to a few, it will prove of great benefit to the many. And so again, you've got someone, presumably a fairly well-off newspaper editor, is quite unconcerned with falls in prices, because that's not his price that's going to fall, it's going to be the fall of other workers. And he's quite happy to have cheaper furniture. And this, of course, immediately links Chinese workers with this whole dispute, this whole question of whether it's better to have cheap goods or higher wages. But the interesting thing about this date, this is 1830. So this is still right in the middle of the convict period. So normally we talk about Chinese workers coming in to replace convict workers, as the shepherds and others, and that, of course, it does happen. But you can see, even at this period, people are willing to bring in contracted workers. So obviously on the contract means that they're only going to accept a certain amount of money. We don't know what their contracts were for at this period, but presumably that meant that they were cheaper than local workers. And this is because we're talking, as I said, about a convict colony. We're talking about colony of New South Wales, which at this period, early period, 1830, still included Victoria and Queensland. And in this period, the colonial elite have grown up, mostly people who have been granted large swathes of land, or squatters who are also squatting on large bits of land, mostly trying to make their money out of sheep, and running sheep. And this, of course, before wires, before fences, so the sheep are running over large tracts of land and need to be looked after by shepherds who have to follow these sheep around and protect them. Now, transportation of convicts ends in 1840 in New South Wales, ends a little later in Tasmania, and later again in West Australia. Now, these convicts, of course, represent to the colonial elite cheap labour, cheap and controllable labour. That is to say, they've got no choice if they're going to go out and look after sheep in some remote area or whatever other kind of work they're set to. But as convicts disappear, the pastoralists find it more and more difficult to hold on to their workers, who are then absconding in increasing numbers, as I say, leaving their sheep or leaving whatever jobs they're put to. So one solution to this labour, what's considered to be a labour shortage, is Chinese contract labour, although also importation of people from India is also tried at one point. So this question of labour immediately brings up the question of labour free or unfree. So from the pastoralist point of view, the men were refusing to bind themselves under contract, attending to sheep in a slovenly manner and demanding exorbitant wages and more rations than they could possibly consume without waste. So there's, of course, there's a typical view of a person having to pay wages. How dare you ask for more wages? You're only going to waste it anyway. So they all felt they had a lack of power to retain their labour force, and they believed this threatened their very way of life. They got used to having these large tracts of land and having other people work it for them, and the idea of not being able to do that sent them into a crisis. So these landowners saw imported indentured labour as a solution, although some of them also kept agitating for a renewal of transportation at the same time. The workers, on the other hand, of course, naturally preferred higher wages, but you've got to also remember that these were mostly ex-convicts who were very associated with convict history at this time. And so for them, the idea of any kind of unfree labour was very hostile. The idea of renewing transportation or bringing in any kind of indentured labour was just a direct threat to them. It's kind of like bringing back this nightmare of the past of when they themselves were unfree. So they could feel that, I think, very much psychologically. So it's not just a matter of wanting high wages. That's easy to understand. But they felt how bad this system had been, and they were very hostile to these landowners arguing about alternative labour arrangements. But there are reasons for this. I mean, in 1841, for example, it was worked out that the cost of a free labourer for a year was something over £41, whereas a prisoner cost £16, and a coolie, that is to say an indentured worker, was some £18. This is in 1841. But it wasn't until 1847 that the first large numbers of Chinese contractor workers came in, when Robert Towns proposed a solution. And he proposed bringing in people from Amoy. Just as an aside, this word coolie is sometimes seen to be a Chinese word, but it's likely to have been a Tamil word for labourer rather than of Chinese origin, despite the very neat etymology of coolie, meaning literally bitter strength. Probably that was made up at a later date. And another aside is that when Robert Towns brings in people, he brings them in at far less than £18 per year. In fact, the people who he brought in 1847 were only paid about £5 or £6 per year. So Robert Towns. The question is then, why did he bring them in from Amoy? Or how was he able to bring them in from Amoy? Of course, the answer to that is in between the Opium War has occurred. And so this means that a couple of things. Hong Kong gets established, but also the Treaty of Nanjing opens up treaty ports. Let's say ports where the Qing government is forced to allow European and particularly British merchants to operate, and therefore they are able to make direct contact with people in places such as Amoy or Xiamen being one of the treaty ports. And so as a result of this beginning of this trade, some well over 3,600 Chinese labourers were brought in under contract to New South Wales, which at this point included southern Queensland, between 1848 and 1853. Over 2,500 to New South Wales, the rest to Victoria, which became separate in 1851, also West Australia and South Australia. And just as another aside, to again illustrate this point of the present influencing the past, Townsville, the town Townsville, is named after Robert Towns, and this statue has come under fire recently on the grounds that this is a statue to a slaver, not for bringing in Chinese indentured workers, but for also bringing in people from the South Pacific, which of course is associated with blackbirding and kidnapping and so forth. And so many people, again, perhaps inspired by American history or American events, say, well, why should we have this statue in Townsville? So again, history being interpreted and reinterpreted and coming back. So when it comes to the Amoy workers, are we talking about workers or are we talking about slaves? So recently, again, another example of the present affecting the past, recently a memorial to the Amoy Chinese has been erected in southern Queensland. So quite a number of them went to the pastoralists of southern Queensland and helped to maintain or establish the pastoral industry in that district, some 300 or more. And with this memorial, the interesting thing about it was not just a memorial to these workers, which is very good, but they tended to kind of characterise it in terms of them being all worked to death. Basically, they're all dead. They all died within 5 years under their contracts, and this is why we need a memorial. Now, this is a very exaggerated interpretation of this history. We certainly know many of them were shepherds. We certainly know many people today are descendants of these Amoy workers. So obviously they didn't die, or didn't die so quickly they couldn't get married and have children. We also know from the history that many of them resisted their treatment. Certainly they were very badly treated while under contract. These landowners brought these people in. They were used to dealing with convicts, and they pretty well treated these indentured workers as bad or even worse than convicts had been treated. And so there was much resistance. There were strikes. People went to jail rather than work for these people. They deserted. They particularly deserted when the gold rushes began, and they had an alternative way of getting an income. There's also various attitudes to the importation of these workers. Many people opposed it, partly as being unfree labour or unfair labour, but they also opposed it on the grounds that they've been treated very badly. For instance, the ships like such as Nimrod often came with people who had died on the voyage because of the harsh conditions within the voyage, and many people were sympathetic to that and opposed the trade because it was such a harsh treatment of people. So it varied a lot, and not quite as the memorial to the Amoy Chinese would say. But the interesting thing about this memorial, to take another step further, is that I can understand why people erecting this memorial are interpreting this history in this harsh kind of way, because they're coming from a background of the century of humiliation, which is a way of interpreting history from a Chinese nationalist point of view, which says all the overseas Chinese were treated really badly. And they kind of conflate people's treatment in Peru or Cuba and other parts of the world in the same way. So this is kind of a natural part of people wanting to stake a claim and say and interpret this history. And this is typical of local history, typical of specialist history, of not looking at the broader picture, and it can be argued from an historical point of view. For example, the memorial people would claim that they all died and nobody went back to China. Now, there's no evidence of that at all. We don't have a lot of evidence of people returning, but by and large, looking at the statistics and looking at what evidence we have, there's no reason to believe that most didn't return to China. But of course, significant numbers did remain, and those that did continued to live in Australia and to marry. But to take it further, some people have decided, and this is partly in published but also in private emails, people have begun to talk about this interpretation as somehow a Beijing plot. Those that say that the Chinese government is purposely promoting this kind of history in order for some nefarious reason. Not very clear what it would be. Now, I mention this because I've been mentioning this more in other later chapters of the series. But just how you interpret people's motivations, I think, is part of this perception of China. It's very unusual for historians to suddenly claim some political motivation for people when the history is not correct. History is often not correct. It happens all the time. Historians are always arguing with local historians and amateur historians and family historians who don't get the history right, or they think they don't get the history right. To suddenly announce that they're all being paid by Beijing is a rather bizarre way to interpret the history. But this, again, is part of this continuation of the present influencing the past. And the Amoy Memorial is just one example of that. So before I move on again, I just want to remember, so this is a very general overview of history. So of course, very often individuals aren't being mentioned. And so it's important, I think, to remember that we're talking about people, human beings. We're talking about coolies and Amoy shepherds and Magassan traders and so forth. All these are human beings who have a life of their own. So I just want to bring out one person as an example. No particular reason why I picked on Thomas Gamm, but he's just an example of a man who died in 1906, but he had come to Australia as a shepherd, as an Amoy shepherd. This is his obituary, written up in the local newspaper at Gosford, who said, Mr. Thomas Gamm Sr. had arrived in New South Wales in 1851. He worked for the AA Company. The AA Company, Australian Agricultural Company, employed many of the shepherds. They ran a lot of sheep. He then, like many people, had moved on to the diggings, hanging rock diggings in this case, looking for gold. Whether he absconded from his contract or just finished his contract and moved on, it's not known. He then moved to Wollongong and finally to Wyong, where he lived for 28 years. He worked in the timber trade and storekeeping. And in this report, in this obituary, it says he leaves a large family of 7 sons and 5 daughters. well known and respected in the district. So of course many of his descendants live in Australia today. As a general regret is expressed on all sides of his sudden death, the funeral was largely attended. So this is a very typical obituary you get of people who lived in the district for a period of time. You see thousands of them around the newspapers. It's nothing remarkable about it. It doesn't mention at all that he's Chinese, or was Chinese, or came from China in this particular thing. Now, whether that's intentional, the kind of court, they consider that to be something they didn't want to mention, or whatever, but it does show that he was a well-integrated member of the community. And that doesn't prove or disprove anything about how Amoy shepherds were treated, or whether people were or not died or worked to death or went back to China or not. It's just one example of one person that we should also reflect upon when we look at the history. It's always about people, always about human beings. So now it brings us up to the eve of the gold rushes. And here, of course, next lecture I'll talk about the gold rushes, but I just want to talk about the interesting change that happens as a result of a gold rush. So the gold rushes begin, of course, in California in 1849, and then a couple of years later in Victoria and New South Wales, which led to these goldfields being referred to as the old and new goldfields. Now the reason, what happened was that then you get a shift. So there were plenty of Amoy men on the goldfields. They're leaving the sheep runs and they're going looking for gold. But what really happens, of course, in 1851 and soon after, is that large numbers of people come from the Pearl River Delta. And this transforms the connection. But the reason that's interesting, and I'll just hint at this today, is that almost all of them come from just a handful of counties down here in near the Pearl River Delta, near Hong Kong. So at this point, Hong Kong has been established. And so what they have is easy access to European shipping, which allows them to easily travel across to California or down into the Australian colonies. And it's not just a change in language. It was, the Amoy people spoke Fujian-related dialects. People from this province spoke Cantonese dialects or other languages such as Taishan. But it's also a change in maintaining links, because the one thing remarkable about the Amoy shepherds is that whether they went back to China or not, they didn't continue their links. There is no evidence of anyone going back to China and then sending their son back to Australia, any kind of chain migration. This doesn't happen, whereas this does happen with the Pearl River Delta arrivals. Right from this is the beginning of a continuous link between Australia and China that continues to today. There are people back and forth, going back and forth to the villages. You go to these villages in this area today, and you'll meet people who have grandparents or children in Australia. Continuous connections over many generations. The Amoy people do not do that, even though they were doing it down in Singapore. I mean, many Amoy people went many places around the world, in fact in Southeast Asia. They're continually going back and forth, but they don't do that to Australia. So this is a connection that makes the change that begins in 1851. So in 1851 we have, according to the census of that year, 1,800 Chinese males and 6 females. Over half of them were working still on the indentures or on remote runs, looking for the labour that was done by convicts. The rest were gold seekers, whether they were already Amoy people who had moved on or the first arrivals from Pearl River Delta is unclear. But this means that at this point, because of this crossover point between the indentured labourers coming in and the new arrivals from the Pearl River Delta, that Chinese people are confused at this point as being all coolies and therefore all a threat to free labour. So this kind of connection is made very early on, and it's because of this overlap in this period of history. And you've got to remember also, as far as New South Wales and Victoria is concerned, these are newly self-governing parliaments, and they're still dominated by landowners. So the franchise hasn't been extended just yet. And so there's a very popular fear among those who can't vote that Chinese labour would be allowed to flood into the labour market and compete for the gold as well as other jobs. So this kind of political involvement here. Now in 1851, as Victoria becomes independent, and so the Victorians very quickly decide they're going to determine who comes to this colony. So who's the first people they decide to ban? Anyone guess? Not Chinese, but Tasmanians. They introduced a law in 1853 that they want to exclude ex-convicts from Tasmania. They don't want too many of these Tasmanians. Remember that Ned Kelly's father was a convict from Tasmania, so they probably had some reasonable arguments there. The law was disallowed. The British government did not allow this to happen. In true British hypocritical style, they felt we'd pardon these people, therefore they should go to any colony, But of course the pardons were all conditional, the condition being they could not go to Britain. So Britain was quite happy for them to go anywhere among the Australian colonies, but not to Britain. So that law was disallowed. But nevertheless, the Victorians were able to successfully pass their law in 1855, not banning Chinese people completely, but imposing poll taxes and other shipping limitations in order to reduce the number. So you can see from a very early period, the colonies want to begin to control who's coming in. Up to that point, they had never, or before they had self-government, they had never been able, or never thought of controlling who was coming in, by and large. So now we'll conclude, again, to emphasise that China and the Chinese have always been a part of Australian history, but they've not always been a part of Australian identity. So it's very early days for Australian identity, but people are beginning to identify themselves in various ways. Much of this is fought out over labour, as well as over race and empire. And we should always remember that the long arm of history is often being influenced by both present and past perspectives, and these perspectives can be Australian, and they also can be China perspectives or Chinese perspectives, as people identify coming from China and influencing how people see this history. And this is something that's always happened with history and historical perspectives, and there's nothing unusual about that. But I want to suggest that most of these themes, some of these themes that play out right throughout the 19th century and into the 20th century, predate the gold rush period. So it's interesting to have that perspective. It didn't all start with gold. Gold exacerbated it, gold certainly made things more exaggerated, but these themes about labour, empire, race were all there and would have probably taken place in some way or other, even if there had never been any gold rushes. So I'll just finish there. Again, we've got some suggested readings if you're interested to follow up on some of these themes.
So please join me in thanking Michael for this wonderful talk.